welcome to Cincy Reformed Podcast. I'm Pastor Brandon. I'm joined with Pastor Wise. We are pastors at Westside Reformed Church in Cincinnati, Ohio, part of the United Reformed Church of North America. And today we want to talk about St. Augustine, and specifically, what did St. Augustine have to say about happiness? I mean, obviously, happiness is something that we all desire and people are after. But before we talk specifically about happiness, Zach, could you maybe just briefly, in like a sentence or two, give us an encapsulated view of who in the world is St. Augustine, in case our listener might not have heard of him, or maybe they heard of him, but they don't know really anything about him. Is he still alive today? Is he a person in church history? Who is St. Augustine?
One or two sentences. Thanks, man. That's great. Well, I think probably the most important thing for you to be aware of is that there's a debate in terms of how you say his name. Is it Augustine or Augustine? So that's probably the most hotly debated thing in Christian theology. But no. Augustine. Let's go with Augustine. He was a bishop in North Africa, in Hippo, and he served in that region. And he's been looked at and called a doctor of the church, a title that's given to key theologians in church history. He lived about 400 AD. That's where you want to be thinking about. The early 400s is when he was really writing the most important volumes that he published. And if you're thinking about life in the Western Church, what I mean by Western Church is anything Roman Catholic or anything Reformed or Lutheran or whatever in the West, that you are influenced by Augustine of Hippo, whether you know it or not. Views of sin, views of salvation and grace, views of the church and sacraments. Many of these things are derived from a man with a brain the size of a planet. So I don't know if that's one or two sentences, but that's what I've got for you. But we are talking about his views on happiness and joy and affection, something that I've very much appreciated in terms of Augustine. But I think maybe before we start thinking about his particular view on joy and affections, Brandon, maybe you can set the stage for us in terms of some various views out there, so we can maybe focus our attention in on his own contribution to the topic.
Sure. Like I said, everybody is looking for happiness, and I think that people have noticed that about human nature throughout history. Aristotle said, the end towards which all human acts are directed is happiness. So people are out to find their own happiness, and that seems to be the driving force behind a lot of our actions. The dictionary defines happiness. I think that would be a good thing to kind of define if we're going to talk about happiness. The dictionary defines happiness as a state of well-being and contentment, a pleasurable or satisfying experience. So like Aristotle said, many people throughout the history of humanity have taken notice that we are driven by pleasure, driven by happiness, but we've not agreed with where to find happiness, what brings happiness, what happiness is. There have been many different thinkers throughout, especially in the kind of the early Greek philosophical years, trying to grapple with what is happiness and what should the chief end of man be. One Greek philosopher by the name of Callicles, he said that the enlightened person should aim for maximal pleasure. And so that should be our pursuit. We should just aim, maximize our pleasure. And he said we need to get rid of like morals and traditional morals that are in society. He kind of viewed those as shackles that kind of enslave us from really getting our highest pleasure. And we should be after our highest pleasure. Epicurus, like Aristotle, said the goal in life is to be happy. Like Callicles, he He wanted this kind of driving force where we would find and maximize our pleasure in this life. And he defined pleasure or happiness as the absence of pain. So, no pain in life, in the absence of pain, feeling well, excited, and so again, we have a lot of people trying to grapple with what is happiness, how best to find happiness. Some people have argued that we should do whatever makes us happy like every second throughout the day. Other people have had long-term goals of happiness, saying, well, let's find happiness, but but if you're, for example, getting drunk every day because that's what makes you happy, you're not going to live very long, because you're going to damage your health. That's a good short-term happiness kind of program, but not a very good long-term happiness program. So people have debated, should we be more short-term oriented, long-term oriented? How should we understand these things? And so there's just been a lot of chaos in terms of how people have thought of happiness and been driven towards happiness. So that's kind of the context, maybe.
That's helpful, and I think that's interesting that you're quoting these very ancient philosophers, yet I could just as easily hear somebody today saying something very similar, probably not quite so eloquently. But how about you maybe start giving us a little bit of feel for Augustine and his contribution then? Yeah,
so one of the key places to find St. Augustine's view of happiness and really just the Christian life and life toward God would be in his just classic work, the Confessions. The Confessions of St. Augustine. I would just recommend this book. I've read it several times, and every time I just get more and more out of it. It is such a sweet, awesome book, the Confessions. So I want to read just a couple statements from the Confessions to kind of orient us to Augustine and how Augustine is advancing this view of happiness. Because Augustine says in the Confessions, there is indeed a sense in which when anyone has his desire, he is happy. But what Augustine is going to argue is that our happiness is found in God. And he prays to God, and in one of his prayers to God, he says, when I seek you, my God, I am seeking the happy life. So the search for God for Augustine is the search for a happy life. In Book 10 of the Confessions, he says this. He says, although one could choose his joy in this way and another in that way, all have one goal which they strive to attain, namely, to have joy. This joy, then, being something that no one can say he has not experienced, is therefore found in the memory, and it is recognized whenever the phrase, a happy life, is heard. Far be it from me to think I am happy because of any and all the joys I have. For there is a joy not granted to the wicked, but only to those who worship you thankfully. And this joy you yourself are. The happy life is this, to rejoice in you, to you, and for you. This is, and there is no other. So for Augustine, clearly, the happy life is a life that rejoices, that worships, that is thankful to God and who God is and what God has done. Now, St. Augustine isn't saying that God is somehow the only joy. He does say, well, there are lesser joys. God gives good things, James chapter 1, verse 17 tells us. So there are good things that God bestows. There are gifts that he gives, but those gifts are not somehow over the giver. The giver is over the gifts. There are lesser joys. St. Augustine says, if bodies please you, praise God for them, and turn your love back from them to their Maker, lest you should displease him in being pleased by them. In other words, he's saying, if you're reading a good book and it's giving you pleasure, go to God and thank him. Don't find it all in the book. Don't find it all in the gift. If there's a gift that gives you so much joy and pleasure, that joy and pleasure ought to be ultimately directed towards God and thankfulness for what He has given in connection with Him as your highest joy. So subordinate joys for Augustine should always be subordinate. He says elsewhere, he says, certainly these lower things have their delights, but not like my God, who made all things. For in Him doth the righteous delight, and He is the joy of the upright in heart. So again, God is the supreme joy, the highest joy. Psalm 16, at God's right hand are pleasures forevermore. And so He wants us to maintain the highest joy is found in God. And so what is unbelief then to St. Augustine? It is someone who's not looking for their highest joy at that point. Unbelief is someone who's rejecting the highest possible happiness. St. Augustine says, those who find their joy in things outside become easily vain and waste themselves on things that are seen and temporal. And I love what he says next. He says, and with their minds starving, they go licking at shadows. Unbelief is licking shadows. And belief is the highest joy possible in God. I just love that comparison he gives. He has such a way with words. Throughout the Confessions, he finds his joy not only in what God has done, redeeming fallen sinners. Obviously, the work of God and the redemption of God, that gives a lot of joy. The hope of what God has done and the hope of eternal life with God. But also, he has joy in just who God is. Throughout the Confessions, he will talk about the attributes of God and how the attributes of God bring so much delight to him. For example, he talks about how God is all-powerful. He says, you are the all-powerful one who is with me, even before I am with you. And he says, let it happen as you have prepared it, as you give joy and the capacity for joy. So God gives joy, but not only joy, but the capacity to experience the joy. He is the all-powerful one. He can do this. And so that view of happiness really shapes and calibrates how Augustine views evangelism. Imagine, he's yes, he has a view of hell, that if you do not repent and believe, you are going there, and that is something that is in his theology for sure. But he has a message to unbelievers that is calibrated about happiness and joy and who God is. He says this to people who are outside of Christ. He says, return, sinner, to your own heart and cling to him who made you. Stand in him and you shall stand fast. Rest in him and you shall find peace. He who enters into God enters into the joy of his Lord. Those who are outside of Christ, St. Augustine says, our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. So he says, the unbeliever, your heart is restless. You're finding joy in lesser things. You're finding joy in lesser joys, and you're missing the highest joy possible, which is only found in God, and you're licking shadows. And you need to run to God, to be found in God, the highest joy possible. He says that if a sinner is being distracted by lesser joys and rejecting God and preferring a lesser joy, here's what Augustine says. He says, such crooked ways, unhappy the audacious soul, which hoped that by abandoning you, it would find something better. See this servant of yours, fleeing from his Lord and following a shadow. What rottenness! What monstrousness of life and abyss of death. Those who find ultimate joy in a subordinate joy is in the abyss of death. And I'll end with a prayer that Augustine prays to God in the Confessions. He says, "You gleamed and shined and chased away my blindness. You breathed fragrant odors, and I drew in my breath. And now I pant for you. I taste, and now I hunger and thirst. You touch me, and now I burn for your peace. Give what you command, and command what you will." What a great statement. And I think Augustine, in my own thoughts, has really just recalibrated, I think, how I think about the Christian life and God, and it's just a great piece of work. I really heartily recommend the Confessions. But Zac, on a more pastoral note, I mean, I've talked with people who has looked at the Christian life and they said the Christian life is a killjoy. They would say, I can sleep with whoever I want, I can get drunk every day, I can say the F word 1,000,000 times a day, I'm free to do all of those things, and you're shackled, and you are having no fun, and there's no happiness, and so on and so forth. How would you speak into that, or respond to somebody who is thinking that joy is somehow found in sex and drugs and parties and all of these things, and somehow the Christian is missing out on all the fun?
Well, I mean, that's probably one of the key objections that is had, isn't it, to the Christian faith? And I think we really need to think about what it means to be a human being. And it's kind of what, Augustine's touching on within that is, what are we made for? How are we created? And what is the kind of joy and so forth that satisfies not merely in the instant in which is experienced, but that satisfies even when we are in a miserable situation. So what's going to give us joy when we're in a hospital bed? What's going to give us joy in the darkest hours of night? What's going to give us that sense of fulfillment that doesn't require a more powerful drug than the last drug we took? But what is the kind of gift and what ultimately giver that can truly satisfy the person? And I think that comes back to an understanding of what we were created to be. Because if we were created to be just some materialist animal that's seeking one's immediate, momentary pleasure, then I guess that's what we just seek after, is the latest drug to get the highest hit and whatever. But if we are created to be something that transcends these earthly pleasures, these cheap forms of entertainment, then we must seek something that's far above these things. And the giver of the gifts, as Augustine was saying. And so, as Brandon kind of hinted, I think, a second ago, that person who seeks these things believes that he or she is free. But if that's not what we were created to do, and what we were created to seek, and what we were created to find pleasure in, then it's actually not freedom, it's actually slavery. Because you're not fulfilling what God appointed for you to be. And so freedom is really found in embodying and in living in the way and in the form that God has appointed for us. And so from the outside, it might look like the Christian is in shackles, and a Christian is, falling short of what we possibly could find. But we actually find within the Christian life that we are fulfilling the very purpose of God for ourselves, and that experience of fulfillment is tasted only in part in this life, but the age to come, the blessedness of the new creation, is where that pleasure, that fullness of joy, the abundance of life that Christ speaks of, and that Psalm 16 speaks of, as you mentioned earlier, that's where that is found in all of its fullness. So, anything else you might add to that, Brandon?
No, I mean, I like what you said about how we were designed. Years ago, I was giving a children's message, and I said to the children, what if Superman came down, picked up a train, took the train off the tracks, put it in the middle of the forest, and said, "You're free. Do whatever you want." The train won't be able to move in the forest. It wasn't designed that way. The train was designed to work on the tracks appointed, and like humans were designed to live on the tracks that God has made, and to go with the grain of reality that God has set. And so when we try to go against the grain of reality by perverting what God has ordained and calling that freedom, calling that joy, again, that slavery, and we're not functioning right. The train is truly free when the train is on the tracks. And we are truly free when we are on God's tracks, and we are fulfilling the purposes that He has designed for us, and finding our joy in Him, who is the highest joy possible.
Appreciate those words, Brandon. Thanks much. And thank you guys for joining us today for this episode of Cincy Reformed Podcast. You can find us online at cincyreformed.org. And Cincy Reformed is sponsored by Westside Reformed Church. If you're in Cincinnati, join us at 10 a.m. on a Sunday morning. We'd love to have you. So until next time, thank you.
Thank you.